Welcome. Today, January 25, is National Women's Health Research Day. 6 years ago to this day, on January 25, 2016, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, implemented a first-of-its-kind policy requiring researchers to consider sex as a critical biological variable in federally funded research. This policy formally recognized the value of sex-based biomedical research and acknowledges the need for more inclusive and more accurate research studies with participation by women and people of color. I am Erica Ollmann Saphire, the President, CEO, and a professor at La Jolla Institute for Immunology. I am so pleased to announce to you today a partnership between WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters, and LJI, the La Jolla Institute for Immunology. WHAM is a national organization advocating for women's health. LJI is an internationally recognized think tank doing research to understand and harness the human immune system. This is a natural and accelerating pairing because the human immune system has a central role in nearly every human disease. And new research shows us that the immune responses of women are frequently different from the immune responses of men. And information uncovered in exploring why there are these differences will help us detect, treat, and prevent disease. Today, to talk about this partnership and the importance of women's health, I am delighted to introduce the leader of WHAM and the inspirational force behind our partnership, Carolee Lee. Carolee is an executive, an entrepreneur, a galvanizing force, and a leader unafraid to make needed change in the right directions. Carolee Lee began her business career when she founded Carolee Designs, and she grew that company from her kitchen table to a global enterprise. In building something new and lasting and important, there are tough decisions and sleepless nights. Personal and professional networks and partnerships like this one are essential from going from a person's starting idea to the lasting change we need. In response to this concept, Carolee also founded Access Circles, a network of passionate, bold women who are change makers and who have risen to the top of their industries or careers. And in 2018, Carolee launched WHAM, a nonprofit organization to improve the health of women by accelerating attention to sex and gender in medical research. Carolee has furthered this network through a partnership with the RAND Corporation. She's a founding board member of the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, and she serves on the Women's Leadership Board at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Ladies and gentlemen, Carolee Lee.
Thank you, Erica, for that very gracious introduction. As you know, throughout my career, I have sought out innovative collaborations, and I've come to realize just how much they contributed to my success. When I was just beginning this incredible journey of WHAM, I recognized that I needed extraordinary partners to create the synergies which would amplify WHAM's messages and platform. And as I talked to health leaders across the country, La Jolla Institute for Immunology stood out above all other research institutes in this space as a leader and an innovator. I'm thankful for our partnership and for the Institute's incredible forward-thinking leadership on understanding the need and importance of accelerating women's health research. As the founder and CEO of an international brand, women were at the heart of my company, both as customers and employees, 85% of which were women. As an entrepreneur, I started, as you said, at my kitchen table and grew, built, and led a global brand and company, and eventually successfully sold it. So I can tell you from experience that women's health is an economic issue we can't afford to ignore. Let me frame our discussion today with some key data points. Women are the majority of the US population, nearly 50% of the workforce, and control over 60% of personal wealth. In the US, women are responsible for over 85% of consumer spending, more than $11 trillion. Women make over 80% of healthcare decisions. Now think about the data I just outlined for you. Women drive the economy. Yet women are an understudied species and continue to be underrepresented in vital health research. The NIH only began to ensure the inclusion of women in clinical research after an act of Congress in 1993. And it was only in 2016 that the NIH began to require studies to use female mice in animal cells. This impact is far-reaching. It means that when it comes to keeping our economy healthy, we're often using analysis and data that doesn't even apply to half the population, the driving force and engines of our global economy. We know that sex and gender-based health differences and disparities exist. Women are 2/3 of all patients with Alzheimer's disease, and not just because they live longer. They're 80% of all patients with autoimmune conditions and 50% more likely to die within a year following a heart attack than men. In my experience in the C-suite and the boardroom, change starts with data. And it became apparent to me that we lack data about the economic costs, benefits, and social impacts of attention to sex and gender in health research across disease areas. In 2018, I shared this data with a group of businesswomen who were motivated, like me, to build the business case for funding research focused on women. We asked ourselves, how is it possible that scientific research could be so insignificant for half the population? And we created WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to increase awareness of and accelerating funding for women's health research. We commissioned the RAND Corporation to create a study on the economic impacts of accelerating women's health research. The WHAM report, The Case to Accelerate Funding of Women's Health Research, is an economic and societal impact analysis. It is the first rigorous data-driven study to measure the economic opportunity and impacts for funding research that specifically focuses on the health of women. We chose 4 areas to study, which we knew disproportionately, exclusively, or differentially affected women: brain health, autoimmune immune disease, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. The report confirmed disparities in funding for women's health research and showed that only 12% of Alzheimer's research, 7% of autoimmune rheumatoid arthritis research dollars, and 4.5% of coronary artery disease research dollars are allocated to projects focused specifically on women. But here's some good news. It turns out women's health research isn't just good science, it's a good investment and yields higher rates of return than general research. For autoimmune rheumatoid arthritis, a debilitating condition that can begin between ages 35 to 55 and causes nearly 1 out of 3 patients to leave the workforce, 60 to 75% of rheumatoid arthritis patients are women, yet just 7% of RA research focuses specifically on women. The WHAM report shows that if we doubled that 7%, adding just $6 million, we would get back 10.5 billion, yes, billion, to our economy. Adding research for each of these disease areas is important because while research can seem siloed, we know that these diseases are actually interconnected, that improving heart health can also improve brain health and more. That makes the imperative for investing in women's health research even stronger. If we implemented the findings in the WHAM report together, we would invest a little over 300 million and get back over 13 billion through greater quality of life, workforce and economic gains, and reduced healthcare costs. We keep asking ourselves, how can we continue to make decisions based on information that excludes 50% of our population, more than half our workforce, 60% of our wealth holders, and 85% of our spenders? Well, we can't, and we shouldn't. No CEO looking at this data would argue to blindly continue with the status quo because no business could afford it. Nor can we, as morally and ethically responsible individuals, turn away from these facts. The WHAM report shows us clearly that this is not just about women. Everyone benefits. Sex and gender research is the gateway to the future of precision medicine. I'd like to share just a few highlights of the responses we've received in the past few months when we share this news.
As a lifetime academic, sitting in the audience, listening to you was music to my ears. Let me tell you why. One is we got good, hard, solid, quality data. Thank you, Carol. And it was analyzed and interpreted beautifully. 1997, right? Women mandated laws requiring women and minorities included in science. 2015, we had to have a law to have female mice included. And we still today, now that we have the data, women and female mice are included, we still don't appropriately analyze all the data. We still don't disaggregate men from women.
The notion that just $300 million could directly affect the 3 diseases that most touch women is a really inspiring thing.
I so respect and admire this data-driven approach to this incredible report. We also have to bring in the empirical voices, the women who we represent, because the anecdotes are so real. Overlooked diagnoses, lack of research to funding for a cure.
The WHAM report has clearly identified specific diseases and chronic conditions that disproportionately affect women. But it has done much more than that. It has given us the costs associated with them. We can no longer hide from what this is doing to our economy and to our families.
All along the way, this report has conservative assumptions in it about the payoff, and yet the payoff is huge.
Thank you so much for the focus that you're putting on women's health, on research on women's health, and the payoff that would not only be for our sisters, but also for the economy, for the federal government and our budget.
Women's health is an economic and public health issue that we as a nation cannot afford to ignore any longer.
Thank you again. I am looking forward to our discussion today and to hearing from the extraordinary leaders who are joining us here today. And I'd now like to introduce Dr. Laurie Frank, Senior Behavioral Scientist at the RAND Corporation and a lead author of the WHAM report. Her current work is focused on methods for incorporating the consumer perspective into health outcomes research and healthcare valuation. Laurie serves on the Personalized Medicine Coalition Board of Directors, as well as the Alzheimer's Foundation of American Medical Scientific and Memory Screening Advisory Board, and is a past president of the International Society for Quality of Life Research. Laurie will share with us the data and details from the WHAM reports in more detail, specifically on the study of rheumatoid arthritis, which we are releasing here today. So thank you, Laurie.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you, Carolee. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we'll have. I want to share just a little background about how we went about conducting these analyses to help set the foundation for that conversation. So here I just want to draw attention to the as you all know, science involves a lot of people, and so many people were involved in this work. Matthew Baird oversaw the economic modeling, and Annie Chen helped to conduct that modeling. I was so pleased to be approached by Carolee about this potential work. The work was exciting to us at RAND because it's actually the focus of a lot of what we do in our research ourselves, especially those of us with an interest in women's health. So as we've heard, clinical research has focused more on men than on women across most disease areas. So why would this be? Certainly there are historical reasons for this, including concerns about controlling for variables like hormonal fluctuation when studying drug effects, or an interest in avoiding pregnancy for some interventional studies. But in the last few decades, there's increasing realization of the problems that this limited attention to women's health brings. So these data here are from an examination of inclusion of women in clinical trials. The bars are showing the median percent of women enrolled in all of the clinical trials that were examined in each of the years indicated. So it's below 50%, but certainly getting there. So here are results showing the percentage of those trials that actually analyzed the data that they did have by sex to see if there were any differences for men and for women. As you can see, very few studies actually analyze their data by sex. So this is just one of many cases showing that females are not always included in research studies, and when they are, there's often limited attention to analyses to examine sex and gender differences. Certainly, this discrepancy has real-world impacts. So I have a few examples here from cardiology. Difference in mortality for men and women in 1 year following a heart attack, women in red, the higher bar. The mortality difference is not well understood, but you've likely heard that physicians can have a difficult time even recognizing heart attacks in women because their symptoms differ from those of men. And in fact, those cardinal symptoms of heart attacks are often based on research conducted on men. So certainly much more that needs to be understood. And as another example, again, another discrepancy here in terms of revascularization rates with men getting this procedure at higher rates than women, not well understood what is behind that care access discrepancy. So WHAM has 4 pillar areas for their work: brain health, heart disease, immunology, and cancer. And we examined different diseases within each of those pillar areas to identify 4 for further analyses. So we have analyses on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, coronary artery disease, lung cancer, and what we'll talk about today, rheumatoid arthritis. The team worked with Carolee and colleagues to determine how to choose the best diseases that would be complementary in different ways and yet would garner the information to address some of the evidence gaps that are evident. So we looked at a few different potential diseases within each of those pillar areas and compared on prevalence, impact to society in terms of productivity costs. We also had to look at the strength of existing evidence and the feasibility, what data are available, including in terms of evidence of research funding, and then determined these were the areas that we would pursue for this set of analyses. To help set the context, I wanted to share that we focused on the impact of innovation on women as patients, but also on men. And we examined the impact of disease and innovation on caregivers as well. And then we took a look at the downstream consequences for society as a whole. So as you've heard, there are existing policies for inclusion of women and females in research. And one of our goals with this work was to build on those existing policies. So both the FDA and the NIH have policies requiring data on both sexes in research. Over time, clinical trials, as I noted, are approaching nearly equal enrollment of women, so that's good. But there are separate policies on incorporating analyses of sex and gender differences in research. And as we saw, not all research adheres to those requirements, leading to what we think is fairly inefficient science. So these results here should be able to help build on the work of representation and addressing gender disparities in research in a way that could inform funding decisions and the allocation of research resources. And we think that this work can also inform strategies to increase value and decrease research waste for dollars invested, as John Ioannidis and colleagues had outlined in their Lancet series. We created a microsimulation model in order to understand possibilities for the future. So the question was, if we double what we invest in women's health right now, what are the downstream consequences for society? I'll note that our work benefited from work of many others on the societal impact of research innovation. That work led us to assume that a year one investment could lead to impacts from years 10 through 30. And we used NIH funding levels as the research investment benchmark, given NIH's role as the major public funder of biomedical and clinical research in the US. Also, to inform our work, we consulted with an expert advisory group that included researchers, funders, patient advocates, and importantly, insurers and the business community. What would they find compelling? We assumed only very small health improvements, as you heard. So we used very conservative assumptions. The health improvements that we modeled were these: decreased age incidence of rheumatoid arthritis, slowed rate of disease progression and decreased severity of disease, and improvements in health-related quality of life. Health outcomes that accrue following research-based innovations, such as the impact here on health, include years of disease-free health and healthcare expenditures associated with outcomes like labor productivity for the individuals with RA, who lose a great deal of work productivity currently, as well as informal caregivers for individuals with RA. And we did also include the quality adjusted life year in the model as a metric. I'll share also that we based our model on individuals ages 25 through 65, which enables us to capture the labor productivity impacts. And that differs from some of the other models that we ran in this series. So for instance, for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, we focused on age 65 plus as the patient. So the conceptual model can be represented like this: funding that's targeted for women's health research is the input. And then the impact of that research funding is assumed to be reflected in specific health improvements from research. And as I mentioned, decreased disease prevalence, slowed progression, and improvements in health-related quality of life. I want to note that we were agnostic about the nature of the innovation, which is an interesting question for us to discuss. Certainly, we made some assumptions about disease modification from research-based innovation, but that is an interesting area for future examination. The health improvements have specific societal level impacts shown here, and we included among those more years of life, fewer disease years, and the productivity impacts. And then those impacts could be quantified in terms of costs, like healthcare costs, labor productivity costs, and the quality adjusted life year. I'll also draw your attention to the bottom of the slide here, where we examined 3 different levels of improvement as part of this work, all really small. As you heard, the assumptions were very conservative. So the smallest level is 0.1% overall health improvement, and the largest was just 1%. Individuals and their informal caregivers lose income as they reduce their time at work or leave work completely due to illness or for caregiving. So that means there's a cost to society that we wanted to capture. We needed to calculate earnings for patients and informal caregivers, but we decided that we needed to be innovative in order to do so. So here, this chart is showing the lifetime earnings in the US for women. And here are earnings for men. And then here are earnings when you examine just the non-Hispanic white men. In the United States, the earnings for these white men exceed those of Black and Latino men and all women on average. So rather than use race and ethnicity and gender to adjust the earnings for the model cohort, as is usually done for models like these, we chose instead to base the earnings calculations for everyone on the earnings of the non-Hispanic white men. This assumption allows for a future in which wage disparity is reduced, and it avoids propagating the gender and race-based labor market discrimination. A reasonable assumption, we think, given the 30-year time frame. And then I just wanted to share that here are the 4 therapeutic areas we examined. showing the funding for research that's focused on women is less than 20% of the total of each of those separate research portfolios. And in some cases, it's well less. And that prior graph was percentage. Here's absolute dollars, the blue showing the limited proportion focused on research on women. So for RA, it's about 8% of the total portfolio. In order to figure out what doubling the investment for the RA portfolio actually meant, we first needed to determine how much is spent on women's health research. So for fiscal 19, NIH invested about $85.7 million in RA research. And of that amount, what proportion is focused on women specifically? Well, the results surprised us and many others working in the field because it was so low. So about 7% based on the dollar amount, and that translates into just $6 million. So this was the benchmark that we used for the models. And I just wanted to show you very quickly that we did examine doubling that investment, but we also looked at tripling that investment. I already shared that there were 3 levels of health improvements that we examined, the small, medium, and large. And I also wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we made an assumption for the results that are in the main report about a larger impact of research investment in women on women than on men, a 3-to-1 ratio, in fact. And we think this assumption is reasonable given that research benefits everyone. If it's directed towards a certain population, you can anticipate a larger impact on that population, but still with impact on other populations. We compared that to the 50-50, the equal impact on women and men. And as you can see, the team completed a lot of analyses. And what's presented is just walking through that smallest amount for that 3-to-1 assumption. So the red bar here is showing the results for the quality adjusted life years. And the overall magnitude of effect for everyone is substantial once you look at what happens across the 30 years. And then we see many, many fewer disease years based on the assumptions in the model. And here I'm benchmarking for you the return on investment based on another disease, coronary artery disease. For rheumatoid arthritis there at the bottom, you can see, as Carolee said, for that $6 million investment, you get quite the return on investment. So the model led us to conclude that investment in women's health research can result in healthcare cost savings that could be substantial, which would be a win from the standpoint of government spending and in terms of some out-of-pocket expenses. Lowering the prevalence of RA could lengthen productive working life and improve the quality of life for patients, as could reducing disease severity. We found large returns on investment, even with very small health improvement assumptions, information that we think is useful for funders to help optimize their actual return on investment thinking. And then our modeling approach could aid with decision-making by funders and by business leaders and payers to support efficient resource allocation. And we have a number of remaining questions, I must say. So the nature of the innovation and how best to target it is one interesting line of inquiry. We've just scratched the surface in terms of understanding impacts for different people in the US. So how would the caregiving experience differ, for example, by gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status? Sex and gender certainly are meaningful variables, but the ways in which these variables are expressed in terms of their downstream consequences for research funding are a function of many other elements of the lived experience. In the US, race and ethnicity are 2 key variables through which these results need to be viewed, and additional analyses could examine that as well. To our knowledge, this is the first analysis of its kind to use a microsimulation model examining socioeconomic impacts of investment in women's health research in the US. Our research is focused on the US health ecosystem. And this enabled us to take advantage of some US-specific data sources and to really drill down. There are some other studies in other countries, but we feel like we used methods that were unique for the US health ecosystem. The interest from NIH has been high in this work, including from the Office for Research on Women's Health, which we're very glad to see. And the work is already being used by those that advocate for increased investment in women's health research, but we think the results could be useful for all types of policy. And then we do want to stress that this is also a tool to help decision makers plan for the future, to help funders decide how to allocate their portfolios and to address the business case for payers and business leaders about investing in women's health research. We're really pleased this work is allowing us to expand the audiences for this nature of the analysis and for whom the work could be relevant. So my contact information is here. Carolee shared the location for the WHAM report, and here's a link for the RAND website where you can find additional technical details about the work. So again, very much looking forward to the discussion, and thank you so much for this invitation.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you, of course, for all of your great work and contributions to bringing the WHAM report to life. It has been so inspiring to be able to partner certainly with you, Dr. Chloe Bird, your team of economists at the RAND Corporation. And as you know, we intend to continue this exciting work in the coming months with you. I'd now like to pass the conversation back to Dr. Saphire, who will share the impact of the WHAM report on medical research and specifically on the Jolla Institute for Immunology, and share with us in more detail how LJI is incorporating sex-based differences into research, as well as other efforts that are currently underway. So it's back to you, Erica.
Thank you, Carolee, and thank you, Laurie, for that wonderful report. So for us, that WHAM report sends a clear-cut message that we, as a body of scientists, need to focus our efforts on why certain conditions particularly affect women. It provides a very clear and powerful economic case for it. Now, this is good for science, too, because all you can really hope for in scientific research is a clear variable and a clear result. Here, we have it. There are clear differences between men and women in the immune system, how we respond to diseases, markers of health, markers of progression disease, and how we might treat diseases. And attention to that fundamental issue of the role of sex in progression of disease and detection of disease is needed both by individual researchers in their laboratories and by institutions who can galvanize researchers together and provide the light and resources to propel the discoveries that we need. We've known for a long time that sex and gender play an important role in health and disease, but we haven't addressed the underlying reasons why in our body of medical literature. This is particularly important for immunology because the immune system plays a central controlling role in nearly every human disease. You know about infectious disease, but the immune system is also essential for detecting and clearing cancer cells when they are individual cells too small for any surgeon scalpel to find. The immune system plays a central role in heart disease, also in neurodegenerative disease. Understanding that immune system is going to be especially important for understanding and improving the health of women. There are key differences between the immune responses in biologically male and female individuals, down to individual male and female cells. Every cell in your body has 2 X chromosomes or an X and a Y. There are a lot of immune genes on that X. Females, as a result, launch a more powerful inflammatory response than do males. That's great for infectious disease. Females clear viral infections faster than males, but that's bad for autoimmune disease. Females can launch a more powerful response of autoantibodies. And that's important for how we might make and steer our treatments. So for example, antibody treatments are some of the biggest blockbuster drugs on the market for treating a variety of diseases, including cancers and autoimmune disease. But of a class of antibody molecules that target a molecule called TNF-alpha used in autoimmune disease, there are some that only work in females and really don't work so well in males because they've been able to harness that more powerful immune response, but that's not an effective therapy for the males that might need it. There are other therapies, other antibodies that also target TNF-alpha, for which women are dropping out of treatment at twice the rate of adverse effects because the inflammatory response is thought to be too strong. So if we understand the differences, we can harness them and we can make treatments that better protect everybody. Mapping and comparing those immune gene differences between male and female cells from dozens of different kinds of cells that make up your immune system, from thousands of people we have studied, is something that LJI researchers are known for because they've got the tools and they've got that expertise. In fact, our researchers here are home of multiple national resources for exactly that kind of information. One of those tools is an atlas called DICE. DICE is an acronym for Database of Immune Cell Epigenetics and Epigenomics. That database contains the massive amount of data generated by the experiments, and by sifting through that data, our researchers have already uncovered some surprising features of the immune system. For example, they learned that gene activity in some kinds of immune cells differs dramatically between males and females. They've also been following up on some other intriguing leads, investigating the role of certain genes that their data suggests may be relevant to disease. But we've only scratched the surface. The team is eager for other researchers to take advantage of this data as well. In fact, the DICE database and other databases that we house were designed to make it easy for any researcher worldwide to dig in. The important thing is that the light is now being shined on these important differences that we can use to improve human health. For years, researchers had actually downplayed the health differences between men and women. Researchers believed that in general, we should observe similar results in male and female mice. And if you didn't, that was an artifact, something wrong with your study, as opposed to a bona fide biological phenomenon. Clinical trials often only enrolled men, so the data just simply wasn't there. Nobody asked the question. So it never got into the medical literature, and it was never taught to medical students or to scientists. It's like when you lose your keys in the dark. You look where the street light is shining. Anywhere else where no one shined that light, you don't see them. Anywhere else where no one shined the light, or no one thought to ask the question about, will this work the same in male and female people or male and female cells? All that information remained unknown. And around the time when more women began working in biomedical research, they started asking new questions. What if we actually tried to learn from these sex-specific differences? What if that was a variable from which we could glean useful information? In 1986, the NIH required women to be included in clinical trials. There was no requirement before. A drug could be approved without it having been tried on women. Once scientists started to compare results between males and females, the sex-specific differences were glaring. Women are better at fighting off infection, but we're more likely to develop autoimmune disease. Men are more prone to heart disease, but it manifests differently in women. And women are more likely to die in the year following a heart attack. Women can be more prone to Alzheimer's, men are more prone to neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's. But using male and female mice is not enough. What we need is a deliberate approach that considers sex when we design and analyze experiments, so we can ensure that women and men get the full benefit of treatments that are in tune with their biology. This is the research that's going in now at LJI. And these are some of the strategic programs that we are further developing. So for example, I already mentioned the DICE database, which is deliberately designed to give researchers around the world insight into how individual genetic variation, including sex-based differences, affects the overall immune response. Our professor, Dr. Sonia Sharma, is part of an NIH-funded Center of Excellence that specifically studies sex differences in inflammation. Her laboratory has uncovered a specific group of bioactive lipids that show up in dramatically different numbers in men and women with inflammatory diseases. These lipids may represent the hidden factors that explain those sex-specific differences and how men and women develop heart disease, Alzheimer's, COVID-19, and other inflammatory disorders. Our professor Anjana Rao works on two proteins encoded by the X chromosome that could be linked to those male-female differences. One plays a role in autoimmune disease, and the other is involved in inflammation, cancer, and aging. And several of our labs study the devastating effects of viral infection during pregnancy on developing fetuses. You've all heard about how Zika can cause microcephaly, but you may not know that cytomegalovirus, CMV, is the most common cause of birth defects in the US. And in adults with a compromised immune system, CMV can be fatal. We need to understand how these viruses cross the placenta and other immune checkpoint changes that happen in pregnancy. Some of our other work, the Peters and Lindenham labs, are studying infectious disease. Active tuberculosis, which is a global health problem, is more prevalent in males than females, roughly 2 to 1. We need to understand why. And a project in the Shrestha lab examines the mechanisms of protective versus pathological immune responses during pregnancy, in mothers at the paternal-fetal interface, and in babies using different mouse models of infection with Zika and infection with SARS-CoV-2. So that's some of the work that we're doing to build a body of knowledge of how the immune system differs between men and women, how we can harness that information in our intentional research and use that information to build better methods to detect disease. What are the markers? Better methods to treat disease. Where females are more protected, what are the molecules? How do we turn that into treatments for everyone? And better treatments and better vaccines for all people. And so we have a lot of efforts underway, and it's an incredibly exciting time for research as all this new information is coming to light. I'd like to now introduce an exciting part of our program today, a panel discussion with Carolee Lee moderating a panel of experts. And if you have questions in the audience, please use the chat function to put those questions and we'll address them as we can. I'll turn it over back to Carolee.
Well, thank you, Erica. And as always, thank you for the leadership and the exciting work that LJI is doing and your ability to translate it into terminology that the layperson, especially I, can understand. We're extremely grateful for everything you're doing. So I think we have Gail Naughton, who is joining us. And if you would like to introduce Gail, Erica, that would be terrific.
I'm delighted. So Dr. Gail Naughton is the chair of our board of directors at La Jolla Institute for Immunology. And she has been a scientist and an entrepreneur, a founder and a longtime executive of Histogen. And as the leader of our board, she is also helping lead and formulate our scientific initiatives around this area of research, and she has a personal interest in autoimmune disease as well. Dr. Naughton.
Thanks, Erica. I've had a wonderful career focused on medical research, both in and out of academia. After getting my Ph.D. from NYU Medical Center, I stayed on as a postdoc and then faculty, and was lucky enough to make a discovery of how to grow tissue in 3 dimensions. And that led to the founding of my first company. And as a medical researcher, I became absolutely enthralled with how important it was to get new innovation to unmet clinical needs. And what we're talking here today is tremendous unmet clinical needs. I also lived firsthand over the last 35 plus years, how it made no sense doing all of the testing in male animals and then getting surprises when we went into the clinic and found different reactions between men and women. In 2002, I was appointed the dean of San Diego State University, needless to say, the first woman scientist ever to run a major business school. And there, I particularly was excited by the fact that research started to focus on the importance of diversity in the workplace, being able to see how a diverse board and a diverse management really has a positive impact on the company's bottom line, having better decisions made, more diversity in terms of opinions and different types of backgrounds. And so that was really great. And so during that period of time, I also sat on a number of public boards, and to my dismay, major companies like C.R. Bard and J&J were dropping their women's health products, particularly because there were adverse reactions that were occurring that were not predicted early on by the testing. And they didn't see how investment at that time into trying to correct the problems would ultimately have a great payoff. Well, today we have heard from Laurie and others, the impact, the economic impact that you can have by putting the money and the time and effort behind doing research specifically on diseases that predominantly affect women. I started my second company in 2007, again in regenerative medicine. And there we started to focus on not only the importance of innovation with regenerative medicine, but and how we can go and have an impact on women as well as men. And so it's been a particular honor for me to be in medical research all this time, to continue to try to have an impact on many lives and seeing firsthand the importance of women in the economy, women in medical research, and how as we increase our focus on the diversity and focus on women's diseases, we can really have a great impact. I think one of the greatest honors I ever had was being involved, and is being involved with La Jolla Institute, because here we really are dedicated to WHAM, not just with our CEO, who's at our helm, a major leader in this whole initiative, the board under my direction, being very much dedicated to seeing the success, but throughout the faculty, having them embrace this research and really be dedicated to doing better and better research focused on these very important women issues. So it's all in all a tremendous, tremendous initiative, and I'm so proud to be involved with it.
Well, thank you, Gail. And of course, I'm so humbled to have the opportunity to work with you. And I really look forward in the future to partnering more closely with you in LJI. You have a personal connection to autoimmune disease as well, and to the research and systemic barriers experienced from the female patient side. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. About 10 years ago, my middle daughter was diagnosed with a severe autoimmune disease called systemic scleroderma. That's where the collagen in your body basically becomes rock hard. So over time, not only are all your joints and spine involved, but basically you die because your heart can no longer be flexible enough to pump and your lungs can no longer be flexible enough to breathe. It took a long time to diagnose her. She probably had the symptoms for at least 15 years, but because she didn't present herself with the traditional findings, which normally start with the skin, she was overlooked for a long, long time, and basically was finally tested for this out of desperation by her physician. So I really, really have lived seeing her from going to being a manager at 24-hour fitness and a personal trainer to barely being able to get off the couch. And when I was approached by LJI to become more involved, I embraced the opportunity. I said, I absolutely need to affiliate myself with one of the leading institutes in the world on immunology and autoimmunity. And so it's, I became involved, I became a donor, I became part of the board, and as of end of last year, I'm privileged to be the chair of the board of this great institute. So yes, a tremendous personal involvement.
Well, thank you for that. And I hope we're finding all of the cures and information we need to make her healthy and well. What are the opportunities, Gail, let's start with you, that you might see in the next 2 to 5 years for altering the research funding landscape? Because unless we do, we won't make a change and we'll be in the same place.
Absolutely. I mean, when your report shows the small amount of money that has been focused on women's health problems, it's just mind-boggling. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. So the data speak for itself. I think raising the awareness, as you and your colleagues are doing, is the first step, a tremendous step, because certainly there's going to be a need for much more focused funds, starting with the federal government, on looking at these women-based problems. And of course, to raise awareness with biotech as well as small and large pharma, to say not only are these diseases important, they're key to our society. Investing, I believe, was $300 million now can translate into a $13 billion opportunity, not even counting the amount of people that can stay in the workforce, be productive longer, and have a real tremendous impact on society. About 2 decades ago, orphan diseases became the major focus in large pharma and biotech as well. And these are diseases that weren't barely looked at all because people didn't find that there was going to be an ROI. that was going to be beneficial enough. Well, they showed that that was wrong, and focusing on diseases that are considered orphan has made a great benefit to not only the medical community, but to the economy as well. So now it's time to do the same, to focus on research for women's diseases, put the money, both corporate money, large pharma, small pharma, biotech, as well as federal funds toward addressing these issues and being able to go and have a tremendous impact quickly on finding some of these gender differences and how we can enhance the type of treatments to specifically address the needs of women.
Thank you. Laurie, would you like to take a crack at that as well?
Yes, certainly. So you know that I worked at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute before joining RAND, and I saw firsthand how powerful the lived experience could be in directing research questions and improving the uptake of research results. So what I see in the next 2 to 5 years has to do with establishing value of research investment, but also improving efficiency of the way in which those monies are used. And this patient movement, the patient and public involvement in research, I think is going to take on even a larger role in the next 2 to 5 years, where getting the right people's voices heard about what outcomes are important to measure and which populations to examine will help spur some of that value discussion, because of course we have to ask value for whom. So the value for all types of people within our society.
Thank you for that, Laurie. Erica, I pass that question to you as well.
Well, an important thing to note is the work building on that question that relates to where medicine is going, which is precision medicine. Now, there's so much individuality in disease, why some people are asymptomatic for COVID and others get severe disease, why one sister gets rheumatoid arthritis and another doesn't. And so that's really what we need to do for health and disease, is learn how to address those individual differences, gather and harness that information, of which sex is a key and major driving variable, understand how to prevent and treat disease. So sex is a key part of precision medicine because it affects the manifestation and physiology of so many diseases. We've talked about how men and women are affected differently by cardiovascular disease, by autoimmune disease, by neurodegenerative disease. And we know the immune system plays a critical role in all three. One of the studies that our researcher, Sonia Sharma, just did, looked at the metabolic differences between men and women and people that progressed or did not progress in cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative disease. And what she found, by separating the men and the women and separating within the men and women those that had advancing disease and those for which disease did not advance, certain metabolites, small molecules that seemed to be linked to protection against increasing severity of cardiovascular disease or protection against neurodegenerative disease. And so, great, we found something that opens a door. Now that we have to find out if those molecules are causative or correlative, do they open a door to finding out what the biochemical pathway is so we can understand the cause of that disease, or do they give us a molecule that we know is protective that we can give to all people?
There's so much exciting research that you're doing. I can't keep up with you, but I'm always intrigued and fascinated to hear about it. So thank you for all of that. There is another question that has come in that I'd like to ask you, specifically addressed to you. Is any research into the immunology of COVID helping to understand male-female differences, both specifically about the body's response to coronaviruses and also more generally, e.g. autoimmune disease?
Oh, this is fascinating. Okay,
Yeah.
So you've heard the term man flu, right? Why it is that when the same flu hits the household, dad is sick and bad, but mom gets up and soldiers on and is making soup for the family. Man flu is a real thing. The female immune system seems to conquer and clear viral infection more effectively or more rapidly than the male immune system. This is true for COVID. This is true for influenza. This is true for hepatitis B. This is true for tuberculosis. And so the question is, why? What are the mechanisms? How do we learn from that and harness that to make better vaccines and treatments for all people? But the interesting thing is, whereas females clear that initial COVID response, so we get better faster, don't get sicker, Women are 4 times more likely to get long COVID. The duration for months of that foggy headedness, the lack of energy. And women are a lot more likely than men to get chronic fatigue syndrome. And there's been some effort to try to link that to a viral infection. There could be something there about that more powerful inflammatory response, maybe triggering autoantibodies or something else, maybe persistence of the viral molecules in a way that happens differently. And it could be a genetic difference. It could be a difference in the female microbiome. It could be a difference in female metabolites. There are a lot of things to dissect and unpack there. And the information that's coming out is really exciting. An exciting thing is how quickly it's coming out, because somebody thought to turn on the light switch and ask the right question.
I have a question that I'm going to answer actually. Why, and Laurie, you can jump in as well, and because it involves how we picked our different areas, which is basically because we realized that most women would be affected by one of those 4 areas of disease within her lifetime, and that they were probably somewhat interconnected. And the question is, why is WHAM not addressing the sex difference in respiratory diseases like asthma? I am a postdoc research fellow in a laboratory studying the sex differences in asthma. Well, first of all, our last report, which will be out in the next couple of months, is on lung cancer, which of course, most of us know kills more women than ovarian, uterine, cervical, and breast cancer combined. And Laurie, do you want to just hint a little bit at that one?
Sure, yeah. So I'll reinforce what you said, that we chose exemplar cases within each of those pillar areas. And certainly there are many other disease areas that we all have an interest in and would love to expand the work into. But the idea was to have complementary exemplars. So some of our examples do have higher prevalence in women than men. Some have relatively equal, but also because we're looking at downstream socioeconomic impacts, we also wanted to vary what the impact could be for different family members around the individual with the disease. In the case of lung cancer, the findings are similarly dramatic to what I shared with you today about rheumatoid arthritis. We're quite excited by this, in part because as with RA, lung cancer is another example where there needs to be a focus on prevention, identification or diagnosis of the disease, as well as treatment. And an advantage of the way in which we went about our analyses is that we were agnostic about the relative investment in each of those areas. But I do want to echo what Erica said about the value of personalized medicine and that view in each of those areas. It will expand what we know about prevention, expand what we know about diagnosis, and improve treatment. So the diseases that we selected were intended to be complementary in different ways.
Thank you for that. And then Erica and Gail, all of you, what are the opportunities and hurdles to expanding this research to the related and unexplored frontier of reproductive immunology?
Fascinating question. So it has been hard to study reproductive immunology in the past because you don't want to do experiments on a pregnant woman, right? There's a lot of risks. And so you need model systems. And you can't always do it in mice because a rodent placenta is too different from a human placenta. And so we need to build new model systems. We need to do research on tissue slices, for example, a placenta that could be donated after birth when that baby no longer needs it, to understand the things that happen. And that placenta is one of the most remarkable organs in the human body, how it controls what transports over and over. Antibodies go through to the fetus, but albumin, another important protein in blood, does not. There's a selective transport. And whether viruses go across or not is also key to preventing birth defects. There are also critical immune phenomena that happen in pregnancy. So for example, women with rheumatoid arthritis see their symptoms go away or strongly lessen while they are pregnant, and that lasts a few months until after birth, and the symptoms may come back. So if we can understand what's happening there, to lessen those symptoms and lessen that autoimmune attack in the synovial fluid at the joints, we can come up with a better, more specific treatment for these women beyond just systemic immune suppression. And so these are research projects that we're building, and we're partnering with clinical experts, and we're going to be looking to hire faculty in this area to build those kinds of programs.
Gail, did you want to touch on that at all?
No, it's just, to echo Erica, it's been a fascinating field that hasn't been studied enough, but certainly has tremendous potential, not just on the whole immunology of the reproductive system and learning more about why babies are not rejected and the fascinating things that occur, but really to how to apply that knowledge and the new findings towards specific women's-based diseases. I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years a eruption of exciting findings that are really going to revolutionize how we're going to be able to develop new treatments.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. Well, Erica and Gail, thank you, and LJI, thank you so much for hosting us for the release of the WHAM autoimmune report and for your focused support and leadership in recognizing that this can make such a tremendous difference to us all. And thank you, Laurie and Gail, for your participation and for all you are doing to bring attention to WHAM and being such a great partner of ours. And Erica, I'll pass it back to you with a great deal of gratitude.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes. Would the panel like to answer some more of the questions from the audience?
I'd like to ask Carolee a question.
Great.
Carolee, what can everyone in the audience be doing to get more involved in this tremendously important project?
That's a great question. Clearly, you can go to WHAM's, the whamreport.org's website, sign up for our newsletter. You can contribute to WHAM, which would allow us of women. So the numbers are really very, very skewed, as we know, and part of what WHAM is focused on is to bring attention, first of all, to all of this data, and then to figure out from an advocacy point of view, how we can bring this, which you saw some of the video clips, to the attention of Congress, because at some point, we will need to help create awareness so that we can create a shift or a change. I think ultimately we're looking at how we can affect policy, business, science, and the public, and intermingle and synchronize each of these entities. So we will need to work with business, who needs to know that if you're trying to have 50% of your workforce, which it should be female, let's say by 2025, that's not going to happen based on the data that we're seeing unless we accelerate women's health research. So this all becomes an economic issue, and the way we can all help to try to answer your question more succinctly is to become more aware of the data, share this information and data. We have some incredible infographics on our website, which really boil this down to very simple data points, and help support us both intellectually and financially. And thank you for asking.
Oh, absolutely. Erica, same question for you. I mean, how can people in the audience get more involved with LJI and the important research that you're doing?
You can visit our website, lji.org, and actually the last slide of this presentation is going to have links that you can click and also a QR code. So if you get out your phone, you have it ready, you can snap that QR code and find out how you can get more involved in the initiative and learn more about the research and ways to support the effort.
Thank you.
I would, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I would just wanted to add also to what others in the audience can do, what Carolee said about getting informed and helping us all think through the right questions. So turning on the lights, absolutely, but being able to see things differently and thinking about who are we helping and who might we be unintentionally harming with some of the decisions that are being made now. So
And I will add just a couple of other bullet points to that question. It was such a good one, one that I wasn't necessarily obviously minutely prepared for, but we also have other partnerships that we have formed, such as Bright Focus Foundation in the Alzheimer's space, which has been fantastic. And we're looking to align ourselves in those ways, because I do feel that partnerships such as what we are creating with LJI will augment and accelerate and amplify the messaging. I can't do this. None of us can be on our own. None of us can be siloed, nor should we be. This should be an effort that is synthesized throughout with many different, I believe, many different types of constituents who are involved for this to really change. So I'm deeply indebted to Laurie and the RAND Corporation, with whom we intend to partner to answer many of the questions that I'm sure other people have. But this does take obviously a fair amount of time and financial resources. So I hope that puts it in context.
Carolee, there's a question in the audience about how people are responding, particularly the federal government and pharmaceutical companies. How are they responding to these results?
So remember, WHAM just started in 2018, and we're just starting to release the data. So for example, today is the first time we're releasing the RA data. So I don't have a lot of information or interchange yet with pharmaceutical companies, quite frankly. The release that we did to this, what we refer to as the synthesis report, which is the top line findings of all of the different or the 3 different reports that we released. And that was, I think, on October 28th, where Susan Denser from the Duke Margolis Foundation was moderating. So that is where we had a number of Congress people attending, and you saw some of their reactions. You can go onto our website. Again, you'll find that and find more of the reactions. I think people are genuinely mortified when they understand, like all of us, and you so, I think each of us have so brilliantly, or I should say Gail and you and Laurie have so brilliantly outlined how is this possible, right? I mean, how is it possible that we're living today the way we are with science advancing to the extent that it is, with heading towards precision medicine? How do you have precision medicine if you're not studying women? If we're different down to the cellular level, how does that work? So I think the first thing is, as I said, we really do need to make sure everyone is very much aware. And as we continue to grow and hopefully have much more interchange with pharmaceutical companies and figure out how to take our advocacy platform and have others, because it won't be us directly, have others adopt and adapt it so that they can influence something as simple as double the budget. So double the budget in those 3 categories. What does that look like? Well, that's what Laurie explained. Take 300 million. Right now, those 3 categories represent $150 million invested in women's health research. Double that budget to 300 million. You wind up with 13 billion. Why wouldn't you do that?
Absolutely. There are some really fascinating scientific questions in the chat. I'll bring up 2. One is, will personalized medicine necessarily result in customized drug therapies that remain in the domain of the most privileged? Great question, but this is why sex as a variable is important. Dosage of drugs and identity of drugs delivered right now are pretty much one size fits all. It's either everybody gets a 300 mg tablet and that's it, or dosage is by body weight. But women are not small men, and men are not large women. That division that separates male and female into rough halves, that's a lot of population. Now, you don't sell the same blue jeans to men and women. We know one size fits all doesn't work for our pants. Surely we can do a better job for life-saving therapies. There's enough of a market and understanding. Do you want to harness that more powerful inflammatory response in a female versus maybe you need to beef it up more in a male? There's enough population there that there's an economic case to dissect that information and make specific therapeutics. It's also an incredible scientific case. Someone else asked, well, what are the biochemical pathways that are different? And if you go to that Cell paper where they introduce the DICE database, you can see it's just about everything. Because it's not just the information that the gene encodes, it's all of the multiple light switches and dimmer switches along that information. That's called the epigenetic modifications. And whether that cell is male or female affects growth factors, transcription regulators, whether the genes are on or off, enzymes that do different activities like phosphatases and peptidases and kinases. It affects nearly every fundamental thing about a cell. It's incredibly powerful information, and there's a whole wealth of it. And there's another question that I think is prescient in the chat, and that's, what about the women-centric syndromes? Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, Raynaud's, lupus, where do those stand in research? And the answer, and I'd like to hear from the others in the panels, I think it's the very same thing. I think that if something is not understood and there's not a clear answer, it's often marginalized. But you can take that information that 4 times as many women get chronic fatigue, 4 times as many women get long COVID. That's a variable. And in that variable, there is information. There's a reason. We can start to dissect why that is, and we can begin to address the causes of those symptoms and find the syndromes and treatments for those syndromes.
I'll just bring it back up also to the sociocultural level. So definitely the research has to take place in basic biomedical arenas. But then what happens? How does it get translated? And yeah, is part of what the research enterprise is doing potentially and unintentionally adding to disparities in terms of knowledge as well as access. And for us at RAND, we're objective and nonpartisan and interested in understanding where the science leads us. But we find it fascinating to think about a new way of viewing the evidence that's out there and arming all these decision makers with better knowledge, but a better way to make the decisions. So with regard to the pharmaceutical industry, we have discussed the ways in which models like these can inform their decision making. How do they decide where to invest the funds and who might be impacted for better and for worse downstream, not just in terms of the clinical impacts, but also in terms of these other real world impacts that we all are facing.
Thank you, Dr. Frank.
And just one other shout out to people like Dr. Janine Clayton at the Office of Research on Women's Health, who's just an amazing driver of making sure that all of the issues that we're talking about and addressing are addressed by them. And to that extent, we have had the pleasure of being invited to speak at the Vivian Pinn seminar and at other places where we can share this kind of data and spread this kind of information. So I think partly, how we socialize all of this data and get more people thinking about this is a very important part of what we do. WHAM is focused on 3 things when we started, which was the Investigators Fund, which was actually to raise money to invest in women's health research projects, which we are in the process of doing. The WHAM Collaborative, which brings together extraordinary women who are focused on women's health research, including Erica, including Dr. Marcia Henderson, Marcia's not a doctor, sorry, Marcia Henderson, who was the deputy director at the FDA, just a large, vast assortment of extraordinary people who are focused on this, and the WHAM report. So those were the 3 areas that we decided to implement, or 3 objectives to implement so that we could create change. I'll pass it back to you, Erica, and again, thank you for all you do.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our panel today, so I'd just like to offer the opportunity for any last remarks from our esteemed panel. I'll begin with you, Dr. Naughton.
This is a great aha moment. It was a great aha moment for me when I first heard about this report and saw some of the results. And I believe that this is really going to transform how we look at medicine and how we look at sex-based differences in diseases. So thank you all and congratulations. And I'm so excited to see how this pans out.
Dr. Frank?
Yeah, so for me, the biggest takeaways are about value and efficiency. We have limited resources in society, how best to use the limited resources we have, and understanding what the impacts could be, not just in the near term, but in the longer term, helps us all to improve the value of what we're doing and improve the efficiency of what we're doing.
And Carolee Lee.
So it's a great quote, which many of you know, which is never underestimate the power of a small group of influential people to create lasting and sustainable change. It's the only thing that ever has. I hope we can all collectively and collaboratively make great change happen. Thank you so much.
We can and we will. And I'd like to thank the audience for your time and your attention today. And the last slide that'll come up next that has a QR code and also links you can click to learn how to get more information about the research, about the initiative, about the WHAM report, and how you can get more involved. Thank you everyone for joining today. There is a recording and we're going to send that out tomorrow to the people that registered. And please feel free to forward it to your friends that you think might be interested and who couldn't join us today. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.